Okay, welcome back to the course. Now, if you've done the previous Raspberry Pi lecture, we did it with the AWS IoT SDK and Python. So we're going to be doing basically the same thing, except now we're going to be doing it with the AWS IoT SDK in Node.js. So basically, the only part that's going to be different about this lecture is going over the coding. So in the last lecture, the first part, we did the provisioning of AWS, which means we had to generate those 3 certificates we needed: the client certificate, the private key, and the root 509 certificate. And then we had to have that AWS full IoT access policy attached to our certificates. Then we moved them over to the Raspberry Pi. The second lecture, we just worked on configuring the Raspberry Pi to handle all the different files and our certificates. So this is almost going to be the same thing, except we're just going to start on what was previously the third lecture. We're just going to go over the code, and I'm going to tell you how to handle the endpoint and the certificates within the Raspberry Pi. Then go over the change from a basic AWS IoT SDK Node.js example, change it to what we want, and then run it and upload our JSON sensor data. So in Raspberry Pi, you should have NPM installed naturally. Otherwise, you'll just need to install NPM as like a file package manager. And you'll start off by putting the SDK we need. Now, there's no designation that said it's called Node.js, so it's just called AWS IoT Device SDK. Maybe it was the first SDK that came out, so it doesn't say Node, but this is the one we want. The second part we're going to do is, in the previous lecture in Python, if you've seen it, we had to hard code the certificates within our Python code. This one's handled a little bit different, being in Node.js. It's just because it was written by different authors and they handle the certificates differently, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So assuming you logged in via PuTTY to your Raspberry Pi. So within Raspberry Pi, where we want to go is, I'm going to go back to the beginning here where you should be in your home directory. Now, from the home directory, there's a whole bunch of things listed here. And again, the naming of this convention after you downloaded the SDK and uploaded it to your Raspberry Pi isn't great. But the one you want to change your directory is Node modules. So it'll say Node WildStar. That's where you want to go first. Then you want to go over to the AWS IoT SDK. And then from within there, you're going to go to examples. Now, within examples, there's a couple of different routes to go. The route we're going to go first is go over to our library. So it's just lib. And within the library, we're going to affect our command line JS. That's where we want to hard code our certificate. So you can just go sudo nano, open it up. And here's where you guys need to put your certificates. Now, speaking of certificates, you don't have to create new certificates. You can recycle the same ones that Mongoose OS gave you, Xerath gave you, or we created previously in the Python example for Raspberry Pi. The reason we can recycle these certificates is they have the correct policy attached to them and they're activated. So much for security, I don't know, but we can reuse those same certificates. So here's where you want to hard code them. I'm going to come down here and show you. And if you go over here to the documentation, it shows you to hard code them over here. This has changed. This is a little bit different, so it's important you pay attention to this. But where we want to hard code them is you're going to go past here, past aliases, and there's going to be a default section. That's where we want to make the change. So under default, client ID, you can keep that whatever you want. Private key, client certificate, and your root certificate. And again, this one added a TXT extension on it when I uploaded it to Raspberry Pi. You don't need this. Again, JavaScript, just like Python's, is robust enough to read the headers of the file and understand this TXT as good as a certificate extension. So these are the only three in this command line you need to change. And again, if you get confused, just go ahead and reference this file here, this docs Amazon latest developer guide for the IoT SDK for Node.js, and it'll kind of tell you how to configure that as well as how to configure Node.js on Raspberry or any Linux device. So that's really helpful. Now that we've got that correctly in there and you've hard-coded and saved it, or you brought the file out to an external editor and reloaded it back with like this FileZilla program, you're all done with your command line JS files. So let's go back over here, and I'm going to go down a directory, go back to examples. Now, when I list my examples, I've made it easier so when I execute my Node.js program, I don't have to put those certificates in a different extension and add additional command lines. So I just did the lazy thing. I reused the same Python certificates we created in the previous example and uploaded them here in this example file. So you can see my certificates, the way I coded them in the command line JS, they're just sitting here where I'm going to be running my JavaScript program. So the program that we're going to alter for this is called deviceexample.js. So rather than opening it in sudo nano, I'm just going to open it in Microsoft Visual Code. This is a free program. It's actually a really good program, except for the fact, like most Microsoft programs, it's severely bloated. But I'm just going to show you from the SDK example what we're changing. Again, this example is called, and this is the one we're changing, deviceexample.js. And this is all we're going to need to change. So it has topic_1 and topic_2. It's using the mqtt.js, not the Payho one we used previously, but it operates exactly the same. Actually, it's here, device stops published, it names our topic, and then it uses a JSON encoder, just like JSON loads or JSON dumps, but in JavaScript it's called stringify for this example. So where it says here, test argument test mode 1, we're going to use the built-in library, which is a time library. Unlike Python or C, most of these libraries are included in JavaScript to run in real time, so it makes it really nice. We don't have to import a bunch of libraries. They're inherently included in Node.js. So we're going to declare a variable of date now. Again, there's all kinds of date manipulations you can use. If you don't like this way this timestamp works for date.now function, you're welcome to look at JavaScript documentation and use your own timestamp. One thing I'll say, you can't declare this as a global, because if you put this variable as date now as a global, you're going to get one time every time you rerun your program. It's not going to change time. When you execute your program, you get the same time over and over. So you need to put it here below your conditional. And then device publish, here I'm just going to put my data object. Previously as a Python object, now it's going to be a JavaScript object. So device ID, hard-coded to whatever you want. Still got this key value pair JSON data format. And here I'm calling my initiated date now variable that's now got a value. So time.dn, which is this variable here, this will give us a timestamp. Temperature, I'm using the math floor. I'm just using the same thing, a random function. This is just how it's done in Node.js. I keep saying JavaScript, it's different, Node.js. And that generates a number between 0 and 100. I'm sorry, 1 and 100. And this generates a number between 1 and 50 for temperature and humidity. I'll provide this code for you. I'm going to have to put it in a zip file because Udemy doesn't naturally support Node.js files, only Python. So just open the zip file and you don't have to type this yourself if you don't want to. But that's the only change we need to make in this device example from the SDK, is this part right here. Other than that, it's exactly the same. So let's go back in there and run it. Now that we changed our device example to what we want, I called it de7.js. So how we're going to run it is this. We're just going to say sudo for superuser node. That's like using Python. Now it's node. de7.js. And that should be enough to run, but if you see that I try to do this, it's going to give me a bunch of errors. And it's not really clear what these errors are, but actually the solution is simple. And I don't know why this isn't in the documentation, but remember the previous example, we had a hard code in the command line as well as the program, the endpoint and all our certificates with different flags. We have to do one flag for this or it's not going to work. But before I do this, let's go ahead and set up our AWS IoT console here for our topic so we actually can receive our topic. And again, this one isn't tied to a push button handler. It's just going to be on a timer. So let's go here to test. Now within test, you can have topic_1 or topic_2. Surprisingly, the default that it'll go to, unless you change the arguments, is topic_2. And that's hard-coded in that Node.js program if you look through it. So I'm going to subscribe to this. Now, okay, now we're ready to receive data from our program. So I'm going to go back over here. Go over here, run the same program, but this time I'm going to put the correct flag. So remember what we didn't add? We had our 3 certificates, but what do we always need? We need an endpoint. And I think previously I called this an MQTT endpoint. Now it doesn't change, but it's not MQTT endpoint. It's just a generic endpoint. It could be used with REST or anything, and it doesn't change. So I shouldn't have been calling it an MQTT endpoint. We're using it with MQTT, but it's good for anything. So let's go ahead and run this now that we did our flag, our capital H, and our endpoint. There we go. It's going to connect, and now it's going to start running our data. So it's not going to show us here because we don't have a command line print. Close this out, and you can see that we're receiving data now. Things are changing. Again, you can change this timestamp to UTC data wherever you want. Just look under Node time notation in that library, and there's all kinds of way to reformat time, and it's very easy to change. But that's pretty much it. So there's not much to change in that program, and this is going to be super easy if you've done the previous Python example. Now, if you haven't done that example, this might be more complicated. I recommend you go back and do that example, and you can also look at setting up AWS for that MQTT-FX tool, where I talk about how to generate the certificates and provision the tool with the right policy for AWS full access. So that's our Node.js example. We've done Python. There's also, I believe, a C SDK and maybe a Go SDK. I don't know that I'm going to keep doing Raspberry examples because I think after this you pretty much understand how they work. And again, if you go to the AWS documentation, if you've done one example and the primary one is the one we did in Python, it's going to be pretty easy to change these other examples if you understand a little bit about these different languages. So I don't think that's too tough. But if it is and you want me to do another example on Raspberry Pi using these SDKs, let me know and I will. And let's move on to the next section where we start going over these AWS functions a little bit more in depth, and I'll see you there.